Hello, this is Peter Gansplus. I will be presenting this webinar today. As you can see, it's me. I am a bachelor in information communication technology, and this is a study I performed in the Netherlands where you are trained to be a developer. From here, I moved into development, and while this was interesting to me at first, I felt that this was not what I wanted to do. I moved into security and ended up eventually at ZeroDayLab, where I work now as an IT security consultant. I specialize in infrastructure, web application, and mobile security, but also lockpicking, training, code review, and anything else we can find, I'll happily do. You can reach me at the email address provided on screen. But let's quickly go on to the main topics, the reason why we're here. The agenda today is 3 different topics: the different types of pen testing we perform, the approach we use to perform these types of pen tests, and the goals we have for these pen tests. So, first of all, the different types of pen testing. The first type we frequently do is the external web application test. The external web application test is a test where we simulate an attack over the internet, as it would be done by, for example, an external attacker or someone from home or someone from an internet cafe or something public. What we mostly look for in these external web application tests are the OWASP top 10 issues. OWASP is a list of the most common web application vulnerabilities. And what you'll often find here are things like SQL injection that you might have heard of, or cross-site scripting, but also much less common issues such as information disclosure, sensitive data exposure, and much, much more. These issues are not the only thing we look for. We look for anything in the application that could be abused. And the OWASP top 10 is mostly a start for us, baseline, if you will. And we work outwards from there. The goal of an external web application test is often to gain access if the application is something that is not commonly accessed by users, or if users have accounts already or can make accounts freely. We look for things like privilege escalation, complete server compromise, or ways that we can mess with the configuration, or ways that the configuration could be wrong in the first place. External web application tests are a very common type of test, and you'll see them frequently. However, this is not the only type of test we do. The second type of test you see a lot is the internal web application test. Internal web application tests are underrated, in my opinion, and they are a type of assessment where we test the application from the perspective of an internal attacker. That is someone like an employee that is disgruntled because he didn't get a promotion, or someone recently fired from the company, or a staff member who wants to make some extra money on the side. Once we look for the OWASP top 10 issues, but we work inwards from there. So we look more into privilege escalation, business logic manipulation, easy ways to hide vulnerabilities in plain sight, data leakage, any ways for maybe an attacker to siphon off data from your database or clients or something along those lines. There is a distinct difference between two in that an internal attack tends to be more thought out and done with more knowledge. So you will find different issues from both sides. The third type of test we do is the secure code review. This is even more thorough than the internal application assessment, and for this we ask the client to provide their entire source code, or at least as much as they are willing to provide, and then we will go over the code mostly line by line to verify that there are no vulnerabilities in here. OAuth 10, of course, is a common occurrence here again, but what you also find in code reviews that you might not find otherwise are business logic issues, race conditions, leaked private keys, and sensitive information that could be stored in the application in a way that you will never find out when testing it from the outside. Core multi-threading is probably the #1 thing that you find with code reviews that you would otherwise never have found, and it has led to multiple findings over the years already. The next one we perform are external infrastructure tests. External infrastructure tests are assessments where we attempt to get into your network or into your cloud infrastructure or into your business from the perspective of an attacker over the internet. So we will attempt to break into your VPN endpoint that your employees might use to work from home, or we will break in through your public website and get access to your domain that way. Or we might try to send phishing emails and gain a foothold on the network that way. Often we find outdated software, we find poorly configured machines, we find very poor segregation, but also missing patches, open ports that the company has forgotten about exist, things that have been opened a long time ago and that were closed, things along those lines. And as you might expect, other than external infrastructure tests, we also perform the internal tests. Once again, this is from the perspective of an employee that might have been let go recently, or an employee that wants to make some money on the side. Once again, we look for outdated software or poorly configured machines, but we also find lots and lots of missing patches, forgotten administrative interfaces, poorly set up domain controls, commonly shared passwords, things along those lines. Next up, we have the host build assessments. This is the type of test that we don't see enough. Host build assessments works on the premise that companies frequently provide an OS to their employees to work from. And of course, as a company, you would want those OSs to be safe. You would want those OSs to be secured, and you want those OSs to be manageable. You don't want everyone to manage their own OS because employees will not update or be slow on patches or install their own software. So the easiest way to do this is to run out a single OS and duplicate that for all machines in the organization. However, if you pick an OS and configure it and spread it across your company, you'll want to make sure that that one first original OS is very, very securely configured. For this, we will test your configuration of your OS before you distribute it, and then we will attempt to find poor configurations, weak service permissions, maybe privilege escalation issues in the application, in the applications running on the system, or maybe even outdated software or missing patches. And lastly, we have the wireless assessment. The wireless assessment is somewhat newer, and it is something that is becoming more and more prevalent as companies offer more and more company Wi-Fi. What you'll often see these days is a company Wi-Fi and a public Wi-Fi. The public Wi-Fi is for guests. They will be able to read their email if need be. But the company Wi-Fi will be used internally by, for example, employees with laptops or for their mobile phones. And what we find a lot recently is that the internal company Wi-Fi is configured like you would do with a home network. There is some level of encryption, there is some setup, but there is no segregation. There is a poor encryption key. Maybe there is not even any radius. Maybe there is, but it's weakly configured. And what we often find when we do these types of tests is that we can easily attack a network, pretend to be part of the network, and then read data being sent over the network by employees. Sometimes we can do that just sitting next to the building. Sometimes we can do it via the guest network that might not be segregated correctly. But there are lots of ways in which we test this. Another one that is living a life of its own at the moment is the mobile assessment. So while most of the other ones that I just discussed are related to systems, servers, desktop PCs, the mobile assessment has a completely different set of rules and a completely different set of goals. Mobile phones these days are more and more common, used for everything. People read their email, people send confidential information maybe, people use apps, people use online services. And these phones are harder to manage than any desktop machine there is. In order to develop a safe app, you have to therefore be extremely sure of what you're doing with your security. If you have poor encryption, or if you accidentally leak information to the system, then any other app on the phone can read this information and steal the information, and it might even be used to attack the user of your application through a third-party app, for example. We find lots of poorly stored encryption keys, sensitive data, apps that do not verify whether the phone is jailbroken or rooted, which would cause a big issue. So overall, mobile assessment is a completely different beast, and something that, once again, is fairly underrated at the moment. So, what do we do to make us different from all the other people out there? How do we do these pen tests without simply running a scan? How do we do so much more for you than anyone else? Let's have a look at the web application test we did earlier. Yes, of course, we do spider the website like all the public tools out there. But what we then do is we try to understand the web application. We look for what is valid behavior, what is normal behavior, what is regular behavior, and we try to also understand what is wrong, what should not be happening. There is no piece of software out there at the moment that can understand what your web application is trying to do. Even the so-called AI-based testing applications do not understand what the application does. They only assume normal behavior. But maybe your application is not normal. Maybe your application is unique in a way that it handles roles or attributes or sessions. And then any tool will simply fail on finding what you need. So we understand the web application by the time the report is done. We understand what a user is supposed to do and what an admin is supposed to do and what no one is supposed to do. We then send very targeted fuzzing attacks to your server. So we try to input not just the standard test payloads that you'll find all over the internet, but if a test payload fails, we try to understand why it fails and improve our payload to see if we can make it work somehow, if there is still a vulnerability. This is more than any application can do. They will always have a list of a fixed number of testing payloads, and if you manage to pass those, then they will tell you it is safe. That is not true, because the attackers in the outside world also will not stop after simply trying 5, 10, 20, 50 basic payloads. They will go for it until they find it. And that is something that you cannot train a machine to do. That is something that we can do for you. We do testing with and without credentials. Testing with credentials is extremely hard to do in a lot of applications. They simply send some credentials the first time, hope for a session token, and then attempt to use that session token in all their requests. But they do not understand what they can do once they have an account. The application will not be able to tell you if you have privilege escalation, if you can perform actions as another user, whereas we can. Another example. In the infrastructure, we don't just scan and tell you, oh, these servers have outdated versions of an OS. These servers run outdated software, and these servers are missing patches. We try to go much further than that. We attempt to look around in your network, look for credentials, maybe sniff some credentials that are being sent over the network by employees that are working their normal jobs. We try to use those credentials to get further into the network, see how far we can propagate, see if we can maybe become a domain controller by stealing some domain controller credentials. We try to reuse your credentials elsewhere in the network to see if we can compromise more accounts. And with this lateral and vertical movement, we eventually try to obtain domain controller credentials or even forced access. Lastly, the wireless assessment. We don't just run a scan to see if you have the correct version of encryption running. We attempt to break it. We attempt to make that extra access point that pretends to be part of your network. We actually go out of our ways to attempt to obtain a handshake and disconnect users from your current network to reconnect them to our own. We go the extra mile to attempt to man in middle those users to get more access to the network. We actually try to exploit your network. Mobile assessments, we try to man in the middle. Once again, we try to steal whatever is on the phone. We try to actually reverse engineer the code and not just run some binary analysis. We try to compromise the phone or even use the phone to compromise the backend server. So we go the extra mile. And what do we want to achieve with this? We have a few patterns that we follow. And of course, these are not the end-all be-all patterns. This is not, you must follow this cycle. These are cycles that we have found to work very well. These are things that we think benefit companies in the long run and in the short term. For example, we have the broad security cycle. We start at the bottom. We look through your application. We look through your network. We look through your apps. We find the issues. We report the issues. And we not only report the issues, we also report our solutions. We follow through with what we think the best way of fixing your issues is. We then give you the report. You hopefully fix the issues, and then eventually, after let's say a year or maybe half a year, you get us back in. We go for another session. We go back in. We try to see what we can break this time. If there's any more to break, if any of the new applications you've introduced in the last half year or year can be broken, we attempt to retest all of the fixes that you have applied to see if we can maybe still bypass those. And we work our way through your entire organization over and over again until it is the best security man can get. We also have an improvement cycle. An improvement cycle is not just us showing up and testing and giving you a report. Our improvement cycle is us working with you to make this better. So once again, we test the entire stack for vulnerabilities. We create the thorough report. But we also pile up all the reports and look for common issues. So we look for the issues that your application might have over and over again, or we look for those issues that are the result of missing knowledge in your development team or in your configuration team. We then train your employees to find those issues themselves, to no longer make those issues, and to overall write better code or configure better. These employees then go back to fix their issues. We come back in and we start from the top. We test the entire stack again. We go make another report, hopefully with fewer findings. And that way, we don't just give you the info every half a year, but we train your team to find the info themselves and become a better organization in general. And this is a very brief overview of what we can do that a simple vulnerability scanner cannot. This is the extent of where our services go, and we go further than this. We have done many projects in various categories, very unique ones, based entirely on the specification of the customer, and we are much more flexible than any piece of software can. I hope this is clear. I hope I have presented my points clearly, but of course, as always, I will have time for questions. Feel free to ask, and I'll be happy to answer.
Does anyone in the room have any questions based on that presentation? We have a question here that which says, is it possible to combine different types of tests, or do they need to run separately? Or can you pick different elements from each type of test to make it bespoke to your company? That's a good question. We do mix and match based on what your company will work for your company. If there are a lot of different aspects, for example, you have a few mobile apps, 3 applications, 2 complete forests, and some separate remote Azure servers, we might actually suggest doing a broad security review where you put your entire company in scope and you give us a time frame, for example, 2 weeks, and then we see how far we can get in those 2 weeks, what we can break, what we can get into, and then of course we'll round it out with a report at the end to tell you exactly what we do. However, we will not just report you the findings in those cases. We will report you. We'll send you a document with the full narrative, so how we did it and what order we did it, which gives you an impression of how an attacker would deal with your current security. It's a good question. Are there any more questions? What do you think about bug bounties? Do these replace the need for pen tests? In general, I would say no. They do not replace the need for pen tests. Bug bounties are a solid principle. They're a good thing to have. For those unaware, bug bounties are basically opening up your application to the outside world and giving people an incentive to research the security of your application. This means that people will report any vulnerability they find to you, and this is usually for a small compensation, financial compensation. While bug bounties are good at finding issues, and while the sheer manpower you get from doing these bug bounties will definitely get you a number of issues, this is more something to do in organizations that have had pen tests and security tests for years without any findings. The reason for this is, as I mentioned, these bug bounties are often financial exchange. If someone finds something, you pay them a fixed amount of money. If you were to do that early on in your organization and a large number of people will attempt to break your server, it is very hard to keep up with all the findings and to weed out duplicates, etc. So in general, I would recommend not starting with bug bounties until you've had a few years of very few findings in your pen tests. Once again, a good question. Let's see if there's any more questions. There's a lot of talk about pen testing needing to be a regular from a compliance perspective, but how often should you test for best practice? In this case, I would say every half a year or every year would be good. In certain very risky areas, it might be useful to do it every every quarter of a year. Sorry, but it varies a bit on based on the type of organization, based on the type of sensitive data you're holding. And in general, that is something that we'll happily discuss with you in case you are looking to get a pen test. If there are no further questions, which I don't see any, then I would like to wrap it up for today. Last time, any questions? Anything? If further questions do come up, oh, actually, we do have one more question here. How may components need to cover doing PT as per PCI PT standard? Sorry, from your question, I gather that you're asking how many of the components would be necessary to cover for a PCI compliancy test. I would recommend going as far as possible. PCI compliancy is necessary. To be PCI compliant, you need to have all your payment components tested and checked. However, being PCI compliant does not mean you are entirely safe. We have seen scenarios before where PCI compliant companies were still attackable through out of scope systems, which let's say were tactically put out of scope for that PCI test. So while the minimum number of components would be any component containing financial information or any database storing that data, I would highly recommend going for the full application. I hope that answers your question. If there are no further questions, then I would like to hereby wrap it up. If you do find that you have any future questions, please feel free to send an email to us at ZeroDayLab.com, to info@ZeroDayLab.com, to us at info@ZeroDayLab.com, and I will thank you all for your attendance.